I'm super excited. I'm very humbled to be up here with the next two people that are coming on up. I want to invite Joseph Nassise and Daphne Higgs to come on up here. We're going to talk about the future of IP, which is extremely important for what we do. Come on up, Joe. Yeah, you can sit wherever. Don't put me too close to Joe. All right, so we're just going to start this off. If you guys just want to give a brief introduction and your background. I know, Joe, you've written like so much, so if you go through all of that, we only have 45 minutes. You want to start us off?
Sure. I wrote my first book on a dare in college to win a case of beer. It sat in a shoebox for 11 years. My wife found it after we got married, convinced me to type it up on an old Brother word processor and send it in. Simon & Schuster bought it. That was back in 2000, and I've been writing ever since. I've had the pleasure of either writing or being involved in 71 book-length projects since then. My work's been translated into 7 languages. I've hit the New York Times, USA Today, Der Spiegel bestseller lists. Had about 1 million copies of my books in print over the last 20 years. So it's been a really fortunate, and I'm very pleased to have had the career I've had in that time.
And Daphne?
As for me, I think there are quite a few mathies here. So I was a math major, or actually I ended up getting a minor in it, but and then to rebel against my family, I decided to go into law. And so I've been practicing in Silicon Valley for about 24 years now. I've gone from Sand Hill Road to Page Mill Road, which are the major areas in Silicon Valley for lawyers and VCs, and there you go.
That's awesome. Yeah, so Daphne actually was with us at a previous startup, and I think once upon a time, Josh and I were like, we probably need like a really good lawyer, and so we called Daphne, and it was like an immediate fit. So again, very humbled to be on the stage with two people very much smarter than me with fantastic careers. And I really kind of want to dig in too. So like, if you guys don't mind, of how you guys got started with Book.io, from how it started with you, Joe, and then Daphne, you can kind of tell the same, and then we're gonna dig into some of the harder stuff.
Sure, happy to do so. One of the things that you learn quickly as an author is the world is kind of against you. The publishing industry, it doesn't always have your best interests at heart, and they take the larger chunk of their share. And as we've talked about content creation and all that, and all the downsides to that. So I'm always on the lookout for a way to reach a new silo of readers, to find a way to get my work out in a new format. And so about 1.5 years ago, I guess it was, I started looking into blockchain. It was something new and different for me. I'd never heard of it before, so I started digging into it, and I started wondering, well, how can this be adapted to publishing? How can I reach a new group of readers by putting my books out on the blockchain? And what I found very quickly is there were very few people out there who were actually doing it, or doing it in any way that made any logical kind of sense, with Book.io being the exception. So on a whim, I emailed Ben one night and said, hey, this is who I am. I'm really interested in what you guys are doing. Maybe we can get together and talk about this a little bit and see where we can take each other. And that has just been an absolutely fabulous partnership. Not only has it been great for me professionally, but Ben's become a real friend, and I've really enjoyed working with the whole team. It's just been an absolute wonderful, wonderful way of taking my career in an entirely new direction. And I've been thrilled to be here.
Yeah, and I would also say during that time I've become somewhat of a fanboy, so it's a little weird having you up here, because I was like, oh, our first conversation was around books, right? And it was like, hey, what are you reading? And we actually brought up, I think, Robert McGammon and like Swan Song, and I was like, oh my gosh, this guy loves the same books I do. And then I very quickly, once we sold his book, started reading his book, and I was like, this is getting weird, because now I'm like a super fan of of my friend, and it was like, "Ah, this is gonna be so awkward next time I see him." But I think, how many books did we sell that first day for you?
25,046 in something like 43 seconds.
Yeah, it was very fast. Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that that was all over the world. Like, obviously, everybody here knows that's like blockchain is borderless, right? So that was all over the world, which is fine, right? Because, you know, a little bit of foreshadowing, because Joe has worldwide rights to his book because he owns that book, and we'll get into a little bit more. So, Daphne, if you want to kind of tell us how you and what you do for us on a weekly or daily basis, besides getting manic calls from Claire.
So first of all, you mentioned that you
Yeah.
and Josh came to me, and you know, I've been doing this, as I said, a long time, and these are dream clients. First of all, really bright people, and hope this doesn't annoy you, but just decent human beings. They hear this all the time from me.
She says it all the time, and it's like she just hasn't got to know us yet.
Yeah. But also just something that is intellectually challenging. You know, it's really rare to find stuff that is really quite transformative and new and novel. So it's a thrill. It's been really exciting. Yeah, you guys have sometimes daily, sometimes weekly questions where I really need to think, talk with the group, and look at, you know, just the laws that we have now, which are rather antiquated, and it's difficult to apply it to very novel things. So that's what's happening on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we can dive into the challenging and the frustrating part a little bit in a while too. But I think, you know, anytime you are pushing the boundaries of technology, mostly with publishing, which is, Joe knows, extremely slowly moving. Like there are frustrations all the time, and mostly when you're dealing with large legal teams from major publishing houses. So let's dive into, you know, kind of licensing model versus digital ownership. Joe, like, what does digital ownership mean for authors, right? If you want to take it through like your perspective, and then we'll kind of ask you the same thing, Daphne.
Yeah, sure. Authors tend to be a little backwards, a little slow to adopt things. Not as slow as the publishing industry overall, but slow enough. And one of the things that for the last several decades, authors have looked at their works as, you know, it's a book. We call it sell, but the reality is I'm gonna license this book to a publisher, and that's all they think about is the book. In the last 10 years, there's been this very slow change where we start thinking about not just the book, but the IP that book represents. Like, this isn't just a book, it's a story, it's a set of characters, it's a setting, and those can be applied in multiple places, in multiple formats, in multiple mediums, in multiple languages, and so on. Where was I going with this? Your question was?
Like, basically, what does digital ownership mean? I mean, again, you're kind of taking us through like this, what is the archaic licensing model,
Yeah.
right? And now you're jumping into own your IP,
Yeah.
and what that means for readers and like how you can connect with them.
So when we license a book to a publisher, we don't know who buys that book. We often don't know how many copies were printed. We don't know how many copies were sold until about anywhere from 6 months to 18 months after the fact. So, you know, if data is the key to everything, we don't have any keys. We don't even have the lock, never mind the keys themselves. And so digital ownership has radically changed that. You know, I know the wallet address of all you guys who have bought any of the 5 books that I've done with Book.io so far. And that is a radical, massive change just in mindset for a guy like me, never mind, you know, all the other authors out there. The idea that we can know who bought our book, that we can communicate with the folks who bought our book, that we can then, you know, provide special offers and unique services and things like that to the people who buy our books. That is so different and so unique and so new that it's literally mind-blowing for a guy like me who's been doing this for some 20-odd years.
And when we sold that first book, how long did it take for you to get paid?
Oh, instantly.
Exactly,
I'm in
yeah.
the background watching those numbers change on the wallet and cheering every time, you know.
Yeah. And I like call him afterwards, and I was like, "Hey man, like everything's sold out," and I think it was like 42 seconds.
Yeah.
So, hey, everything's sold out in 42 seconds, and he was like, "I know."
But and to put that in perspective, if I license a book to a publisher today, I'm going to get, what they call an advance, some money up front, and that money is paid ahead of the royalties that I would expect to make for every copy of the book sold. But that advance is paid out over a 2-year period. One when I sell the idea, part of it when I turn in the manuscript, and finally in the last part when the book actually hits the shelves. So, hey, all right, I might get paid $50,000 to write that book, but that's $50,000 split over 3 payments over 2 years. And then for every copy sold, I'll make about 10%. So if it's, it's a $30 book, I'll make 30 cents. And I won't see any of that until all the money they paid me in the advance is paid back. So this idea that, I can get paid for the sales of the books in real time, in the moment that it is occurring, again, is just simply mind-blowing.
In that moment, if you do sign with a publisher, in that moment, would you say you are the owner of the book anymore?
No, because the publisher will take the rights, and they will take as many rights as possible. So it's not just print, it's not just ebook, it's not just, audiobook. They'll try to take theatrical rights. They'll try to take film and television rights. And these days, you can't split those rights up. I can't just do the print with a publisher. I'm, at the very least, doing print, ebook, and audio, and don't have a lot of say in that. Maybe somebody like Stephen King can decide what rights he's keeping, what rights he's not. But a middle, writer like me, I don't have that luxury.
Yeah, it's strange that you say you're a middle writer who's like literally sold millions and millions of books. So again, congratulations on that. I think, and again, if you guys feel free to jump in at any time, like what do you think digital ownership, how is it viewed in the law right now, in the legal on your side? Like what are people saying? What are the frustrations with it? When you're on these calls with these big publishing houses on our behalf, what is the feedback?
It's just a lack of understanding because for many years we've had this model of licensing. And I'm just going to kind of deviate from books for a second and think about when you get your computer, you get a license to Microsoft Word, let's say, and you cannot transfer that license to another person. And you also, so transferability, and then also you usually have it for a fixed period. Now, with actual ownership, let's just think of walking into a bookstore. You buy a book. You have that book, that physical book, and you can sell it. I can sell it to Joe. Joe, in turn, can sell it to Ben, and onward. Now, in this kind of construct of digital asset ownership, you actually think about that physical book, and get away from that whole ebook notion of licensing it for a fixed period. So it's kind of really difficult for people to understand that. And even when you boil it down to this really basic notion, it's still hard to understand because we've, for so many years, had this notion of, okay, I download something onto my Kindle, I read it, but I can't share it with anyone, so how does this work? And so that's the frustration, is just, even if you explain it, people kind of get the concepts, it's still very difficult to internalize that and understand what rights a person has. And probably the easiest way to think of it is that you're actually getting a physical copy of a book that you in turn can give or sell to another. And onward, and then for the publishers and the authors, every time that sale takes place or that transfer, they can get paid. Like they can get some revenue on that, which is not the case when you buy a book at a bookstore, sell it to another person, the publisher is cut out, the author is cut out.
Ben, you asked if I thought I still controlled a book once I sell it to a publisher, and that fixed length issue is a huge one. A standard publishing contract will say that they control the rights to your book until it goes out of print. And when print was just that, print, a physical hard copy, that was fine. They would print so many of them. You know, I've got a print run of 25,000 copies. When they run out, they're done, rights revert back to me. But when ebooks came out a number of years ago, you can essentially keep a book in print indefinitely as long as there's a digital copy. So writers underwent this process where we were used to getting the rights back to our books after X number of years, and now those X number of years are not so finite. They've become this indefinite, number. I have a series of mine that I'm quite fond of that I will probably never get the rights back to because it still sells a couple hundred books in ebook every quarter.
You want to dive into how they sell those books on your behalf? Do they change the price at all to make sure that they hit those numbers?
So I can write in and say I would like to request my rights back like every 6 months, provided I've reached certain thresholds. And one of those thresholds is it has to sell less than 100 copies in the 6 months prior to the point I send in that letter. So whenever we get close, they take my $14.99 ebook and put it on sale for 99 cents. And, obviously it's going to sell 100 copies at 99 cents. It's not that hard. So therefore, I have to wait another 6 months before I can then restart the process. And that process has now been going on for 10 years plus. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing.
And again, I think this is where, like, when we talk about the digital ownership revolution and where creators sit in it, it's like the creators sit in the driver's seat and they can still own their IP. They can still sell these things. And, like, even with our partnership with Ingram, you'll still be able to print your books, but I'm never going to step in and say, hey, I want to own your work. And I've always felt that like a super interesting thing. Like, Joe and I do talk for... Every time I call him, I'm usually going to call him for like 5 minutes. I'm like, hey, Joe, I just had a quick question. Like 2 hours later, I'm like, all right, man, we got to go. Because it's super interesting to hear from, I guess when even at our old ebook startup, I don't think I ever really heard the frustrations directly from the authors, directly from the creators. And I would also say that the motivation that I think the Book.io team gets from hearing stories of like, hey, we helped Joe sell out in 42 seconds. And then from our community who's like trading those books and excited about those books and reading those books along with you. That's an extremely motivating part for us. So I think you answered this, but would you say publishing is broken?
Oh, yeah. I will say
when did it
publishing
break?
is broken from the writer's standpoint.
Yeah.
Publishers don't think publishing is broken at all.
Yeah.
But they probably should because of what you said earlier about the data. Like, publishers do not have the data about all of these subsequent sales, which in the digital assets model, they do.
Yeah, it's really strange because when we go and talk to publishers, we ask them what kind of data do they want to see from Book.io? What kind of data do you want to see on readers? Actually, obviously on our roadmap is actually tell them what they're actually reading, not like from an anonymous side of like, here's how far people are reading in this book. Obviously, like we have our token that is a read to earn token. That's what it's based on. But it's also really interesting because we've heard some crazy shit coming back from the publishers too, where it's like, at one point we were like, hey, every sale allows somebody for you guys to get royalties. And then there was some excitement, and then there was the question of, is the author gonna see every sale? And I was like, that's a strange question. Like, so like, well, yeah, it's a blockchain, man. Like, this is public. And they were like, oh. And I was like, oh, like, don't you like, and I think that was the shocking part. And we do have some like publishing partners here that I think do not think like that, who I think are the next wave, right? Because I think the other side of it is probably through your long career that you've learned so much about IP because you were forced to, and you're concentrating on the business aspect instead of writing the next book. And I've always found that like to be super interesting of like creators, in that space are more worried about the business and IP side instead of writing the next great book that I want to read. So Daphne, how do you feel like your colleagues view digital ownership? Like I was reading some stats of like, licensing, the legal side of licensing is like obviously $1 billion empire. And then we come in like some freaking cowboys and like, we don't care, man. Digital asset ownership, it's better for everybody. What would you say? Are people interested? Are they learning? Is Silicon Valley interested? Or, again, we've had publishers say, we don't want this to exist.
Oh, I think there are two things. People are interested because there's money there, right? So Silicon Valley is going to be very interested. There's also just something new and challenging, which excites most people. For my colleagues, and this is kind of geeking out here, but we've got copyright law. And you can see now, I'm sure most people are aware about how there are challenges in the AI, like AI created works, and our current copyright laws. So that excitement is the same here, because we've got copyright laws. How does this fit in? And then the next thing is, well, we think it fits. We've done this for ages. We've talked about in the last year or half year or whatever about how will we show that our current somewhat antiquated copyright laws fit this model. And then we've also thought there's a lot of money being lost here for certain people. And so how are they going to challenge this industry? What arguments are they going to come up with to just kind of push this aside, because there's too much money at stake for the people who are really adopting this licensing model? And that is our kind of geek out moment, because we'll sit around and say, well, we can make this argument, and yeah, they'll probably say this, but this is how we screw them over on this point. So that's really exciting for us.
Yeah, like, we talk about it as like the first sale doctrine, which is obviously for physical goods. How do you feel like, how do you see that fitting in the digital world? Is there this idea of like, we need to write this type of stuff and like start shopping it around? Like, what does digital first sale rights mean moving forward?
Yeah, so that's a good question. If, again, think about what I said earlier about you're getting a book in a bookstore. So the copyright owner, the owner who's whether it's the author or the publisher, has certain rights in that book. And the first sale doctrine says, hey, there are going to be some limited rights. When you get that book, owner of the book, you can actually transfer it to another person. Now, when you transfer it, you no longer have that physical book. And the argument is, in the digital world, when that transfer occurs, will the first person, the transferee, have those digital, will they have the book, or will it suddenly vanish and then go to the other party? And what's happened before, and the reason this kind of first sale doctrine has not worked in the digital world, is that people think this digital asset is existing here, it gets transferred, but the person who's transferred it still has those digital rights. That is not what is happening with Book.io. It's structured in a way that when that transfer occurs, those digital rights go to the other party, and it no longer exists with the person who sold it. So this is, I know this is probably geeky law stuff that I'm boring folks, but it's so interesting for me.
It's interesting for us too, because we feel like, I think she does a really great job of explaining it, right? And so she does a really great job of explaining it. We walk into major publishing houses that were like, day one, right? If you were around for day one of the Gutenberg Mint, first of all, we were all really freaking tired. But second of all, we made $110,000 on day one, right? And that's because of what people believe, that they should own their digital books. They should own their stuff, right? If you buy it, you should own it. I don't think it was, obviously the Gutenberg is an example of that. It's in freaking Latin. It's not like everybody in here is reading their Gutenberg, right? So I think it was the rally cry of like, own your stuff. I don't think that's really hard to understand, but going into these publishing houses and having these conversations of like, no, it's just like a physical book, and it always comes down to, yeah, but what if they sell it in the UK? So if you don't mind like kind of educating everybody on like what does that look like in the territories that they're selling these licenses into, because again, and some of you, I think I talked to a couple people yesterday who were like, yeah, I moved, I went from America to Spain, and I lost all of my movies. I lost half of my Kindle shelf, right? And that's because you crossed an ocean in an imaginary line. So I guess what is the thought process from the legal side when at these publishers? What inside of their heads, what are they viewing it as?
Well, when you have a book, and Joe touched on this whole notion of rights, there are a whole bunch of rights in there. And so the author who has the rights transfers some of those rights to the publisher. And in those agreements, it may say, hey, listen, you can sell my book in the US, but you can't sell it in England. So there are limited rights there. And so the thing is that all of those limitations have to be properly outlined. Ideally, you keep as much as you want, right? And then you get to exploit them yourself. But it's difficult in the sense that in the industry, it really has different territories. So there is a stop in certain countries, depending on the agreement that you execute with your publisher.
And from a writer's standpoint, each one of those territories can potentially be another payday. So like my contract with HarperCollins has North American World English rights, which means they can sell the book anywhere in the world in the English language. My contract with Simon & Schuster has US English language rights, which means I can turn around and sell that exact same book to a publisher in the UK English language and get another payday without having to write another book. So every territory, every language, every format is a potential payday for a writer if they're savvy enough to be able to negotiate and maneuver those rights in a way that benefit them. Unfortunately, there are so many writers out there who basically don't even understand copyright, never mind understand the language that shows up in their contracts, and that's to their massive disadvantage.
That brings me to my next question. If you're talking to a new author, right, and we do have some new authors in this audience, what would you recommend that they go through a publisher? At this point, with everything you know and everything that we're building, would you recommend that they go through a publisher? And in the case that you do, why would you tell them to go to a publisher at that point? Like, there are some benefits of signing with a publisher. What are those?
So in my career, I've done about 35 books through New York or major publishers, and I've done another 30 that I've independently published myself. Every project goes through this kind of internal process, which is better for this book. Publishers can do two things that a guy like me can't. They can get distribution, and they can get your book on the shelf in a bookstore, which is the end result of distribution. If you want to walk into a Barnes & Noble and see your book on the shelf, you want that ego stroke that comes with that, then by all means, sell it to a traditional publisher. Here's the thing. When you do that, and I shouldn't say the word sell, I should say license.
There are still Barnes & Nobles?
Yeah,
okay.
Occasionally, here and there. If you do that, you still have to manage all the other stuff that comes with promoting your book. In the old days, you license it to a publisher, and they'd basically handle everything. They'd set up your book tour, they'd do promotional stuff, they'd get you in magazine ads, they'd get you trade publication reviews, all that kind of stuff. Now, 90% of that rests on the writer's shoulders. So if I'm going to do all the work myself, I might as well control all the stuff that goes along with that rather than turning it and the rights to my book over to the publisher. That's oddly enough, that's a hard sell for a lot of writers these days. They're so set on understanding that I license to a publisher, the publisher does everything else, and I don't have to worry about it, despite the fact that that isn't the reality anymore. But that is a big kind of a dam in trying to um, advocate for digital rights ownership with writers, because they're so set in the way it used to be and how they think it actually works when it doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, we hear that all the time. I think, obviously, like, our frustrations usually are on the publishing side, right? Of, like, we will say, I mean, again, like, a lot of you obviously here buy our books, and it's like when you go in, it's like, do you want to make money for your creators? And they're like, meh. And it's like, I mean, again, like, we are arguably the fastest growing publishing startup of all time, right? And then when you walk in there, it's like, hey, we're trying to make money for your authors. And we actually have authors who call us and say, this is my publisher, I want you to talk to him. And we literally get nowhere, right? And that's extremely frustrating, because it's like, we know this book will sell. Some of these are big authors that you guys would definitely buy their books. Some of them are writing about Web3. And some of them come back to us and say, well, I can't do it because I don't own that book. And it's like, did you write the book? And it's like, so I do think it is very, you have to be very careful as an author. If you're out there as an author and you want to be, published, you need to understand your rights. And honestly, like, we were sitting in New York, right? I'm not going to say the publisher because I still want their books. And I said, well, who has the digital ownership rights? They said, well, we don't have digital ownership rights. And I said, okay, so you want me to talk to your authors? It's like, well, no, we don't want you to do that. They don't have the digital ownership rights either. And I was like, man, I know I'm freaking slow, okay? But, like, who would you say has the digital ownership rights? And are they in the room with us right now? And so I think it's so new, right? And I think, one of the things I know, like, everybody in this audience gets impatient. Like, we're impatient. Like, at Book.io, we are the most impatient people. We build as fast as we can. We're trying to do deals as fast as we can. And so that brings me to my next question is, at Book.io, we always say we're building the future of books, right? Now, my question is to both of you, what does the future of books look like for you as an author and from you as the legal side? You want to start us off?
Yeah, sure.
Joe's going to talk for like an hour.
No. So I'm not going to say so much from the legal side I've already touched on. It's just really exciting. Just as an average person, the notion that books can get all over the world, that people are going to have that accessibility, because there's so many places where books just don't get right now. So I love that sort of, I guess, egalitarian approach to the receipt of books. And then last night, I think Charles touched on this whole notion of censorship and things like that. I like the idea that we're not burning books certain places, right? If they're in a digital form, how do we do that? So I love that. And then I think the other thing, and Joe mentioned this earlier, just the data that you get in this model. When you go to different websites, the next week you'll notice that a pair of shoes pops up on your screen or some travel place. That's because data is being collected, they've got a profile on you, and they're providing that. I love the fact for the author, for the publisher, for advertisers or whatever to have that data. It's really beneficial to see, oh, wow, my book has been transferred, 20 times, and this is where it's gone. This is the pace at which it has been transferred. And then with that data, there are other things that can be provided to all of the recipients. So that excites me.
Yeah, I definitely second that. For me, there's two main areas: the data and this content. if I can get information from the publisher that tells me, okay, everybody who read this book stopped at the 28% mark and didn't read any further, that tells me something. I can go back and look at that book and say, okay, what did I do in this book that went so wrong? And how do I fix that for the next book? My job is to entertain you. My job is to take you on an emotional journey throughout that story. And so if I can find those triggers where I can do that in a better and more productive way, that's great. The other side of the coin for future books for me is the content itself. We're all used to DVDs with director's tracks or annotations and commentaries. I want to do that in my books. I want to be able to drop in a video that says, oh, this fight scene that we were just talking about, here's really what's going on behind the scenes. Or, I wrote this particular scene and here's why. And here's what I was thinking when I wrote that. And knowing that, does that change your view of that particular process? I wrote a series of books with a character named Jeremiah Hunt. And Jeremiah Hunt just plainly is an asshole. And I wrote the books to see if I could get you to like this guy, despite who he is and what he was like. And so being able to provide content and talk about that and say, hey, here's why Jeremiah is Jeremiah. And, here's what made him the way he is. And, here's how you can see a little deeper into that story or carry that into the next particular story. Things like art. Billy did a fabulous job on the first several books that I put out with Book.io. And kudos, man. Really, really appreciate it. But one of the things I wanted to get into was how can I express the art myself and my views, and so then I learned how to use some of the tools like Midjourney and started doing the covers. The content allows me to expand my own skill set and to expand the way that I interact with you guys as customers and as readers. And that's just huge. That's something that, I couldn't have done 15, 20 years ago. And I'm so excited about what we'll be able to do, say, 5 years from now, never mind 10 or 15.
Yeah, I would even say as a fan and as a reader, right? It was an interesting journey for me because as I went through that and I saw all the covers, like for The Heretic, right? I went through all the covers and I was like, oh, this looks great. I hadn't read the book yet, right? Like, buy the book, start reading the book, and now it was like, no, I need this cover because this is who Kate is in my mind, right? I spent way too much money on the Devil Dogs, okay? My wife is probably here. It wasn't that bad. It was under $1,000. We're fine. But I felt like it was a way for me to get access as a fan, right? And then I also felt like, from the other fans that you had during that mint, it was what else are we going to give them? Like that's the conversations that you and I always have, and the utility of what blockchain brings is like, what else can we drop to them, right? And I think as we move forward, it's going to be interviews. It could be behind the scene interviews. I've always wanted to see like your notes. I want to see like the process. We obviously have spaces called Open Book, which is like we just want to find out like how do you guys write? Writing a book, obviously a freaking huge undertaking, right? Not like I have so much respect for authors because I just don't think I could do it. Maybe it's I've just been staring at my phone too long. But I also think like I would love to dive into that extra utility, and then also from the creator side, number one, for how should creators protect themselves from the legal side moving forward with these things? Because now we're talking about not only a book, we're talking about airdropping, interviews, we're talking about airdropping video, we're talking about airdrop, like where do their rights fall and all that also?
Well, with respect to a book, when you write it, automatically by law, all of those rights vest in you. And then, as you were mentioning about the agreements, so if you enter into an agreement with a publisher, you have to really look through the various terms because you can assign rights with respect to various territories or rights in, I don't know, your book may be made into a movie and things like that. So it's being very diligent about thinking about all of these rights, but the creator does have those rights. And this is for books. Once you get into music, it gets a little bit more complex, but it's again, these are your rights Know what you are assigning over to others. Know the term, nor know the vast regions that you may be assigning these rights. But you're the controller as the writer.
Yeah, just so you know, like if you want to work with Book.io as an author, we say, yeah, great, it's your book, it's your rights, we want to help you sell it. And also, like, I always find it really interesting that there's so much exclusivity laws out there now. It's like, if you, and it's really interesting the questions that we get mostly from authors as they come in and want to work with us, of like, or is this exclusive to Book.io? And I was like, well, I want you to make money if you want to sell it on these other places. I don't, good for you, like, but it's interesting that, you know, these large centralized companies, right, have continued to beat down the price of ebooks, digital books, and then that ultimately hurts the author. Do you have any idea of like what the typical advance would be these days?
Sure, it depends on the genre, but for a debut novelist, you're making anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 as an advance.
3 to 5,000 USD for
Yep.
for signing away your work.
Split over 2 years. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what job I could do over 2 years that would pay me less than $3,000.
Think about how long it takes to write a book, and then figure out what your hourly rate is, and then go back to that $3,000 to $5,000 figure, and you'll be tearing your hair out in seconds.
I want to thank you for talking everybody out of being an author here. Thank you.
I
so
want
much,
no
Joe.
competition.
You will never sell another book with us. No, I honestly, and I brought that up because we were in New York and we were at a publisher's kind of investment meeting, and I talked to this guy who was a really well-known journalist, and he came up to me afterwards. He's like, "This is the first time I've heard any real utility for blockchain," and he was super excited. And he's like, "Hey, here's my book." And I was like, "This is really awesome." We get into a conversation. I said, "Hey, I would just love to know, like, what was your advance?" And he was like, "Oh, it was about $1,000. And I was like, "Yeah, what? Did you say $1,000? Because at the time I was like, I would just give that to you out of my pocket as a fan of like, if you're selling your book for $1,000, man, I'm buying the rights. Like, I'll take that risk." And it's really interesting to see how low that bar has become and painfully so for authors.
It's dropped considerably in the last 20 years. Like when I started in the industry in 2000, your average advance was somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 for a debut novel. And that was even in crazy genres that didn't sell well, like horror or westerns. Obviously, romance is about 65% of the market out there. Advances are a little higher in that genre. Nonfiction, entirely different ball game, entirely different numbers. So you got to pay attention to exactly what you're talking about. But even in the span of my career, that's what, I can't do math. I'm not a math person. That's a really big drop. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So we're gonna wrap this up. I just want to say, thank you to you both. I have learned so much from the publishing industry, from Joe. I think a lot of the times you usually call your lawyer when something bad's going on, or something needs to be redlined, or what the hell are people thinking? So I wanted to say thank you to you both. If you guys don't mind, give them a round of applause. They've been. Of course.
So I do have one last thing, and it's not a legal thing, but look, thanks to Book.io. The entire team has been incredible. Thanks to all of you guys, too. Being here, it's phenomenal that you're engaged. And then a big thanks to McKinney. Okay, I'd never heard of McKinney, about, 2 years ago. This is my second time here, and what a phenomenal town.
I did have one last question for Joe, which is, when are you going to write a book where I'm the main character?
What's this?
And
How do
what
you know
will-
I haven't?
And And what will my superpower be?
Superpower, wow, that's a tough question. I tend to put people I know in my books and kill them in really miserable ways. So, I'll come up with a really unique way to kill you off instead of giving you a superpower.
It was earlier when you said, I wrote a book about this guy named Jeremiah Hunt. He was a real asshole, and I wanted to see if I could make people like him. I was like, wait a second. Did he already write the book? So I want to thank you both. Seriously, they've been absolutely phenomenal to have them as part of like what I would consider the Book I.O. crew. You guys help us every day, and because of their help, we continue to grow faster and faster and faster. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.